Hi there.
Hi, I guess we'll wait for others to join. Still a little early.
Oh yeah, yeah, we got time.
Hi.
Hi there. Yeah, thank you for organizing this panel, guys. It's been very enjoyable. A lot to think about
Thank
from the
you for
previous session.
participating.
Oh yeah.
And maybe in the next weeks we can restart the discussion for social studies of science that you proposed.
Yeah, I contacted Nicole Nelson the day after we talked about it in person, and I haven't heard back from her. So it's been long enough that I should nudge her again.
Okay.
But presumably she still thinks it's a good idea. But yeah, but this will give some momentum to that, I think.
Finger crossed.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not turning my camera off because like I think if I turn it off, I couldn't turn it back on again. We're gonna wait for a bit longer because we have plenty of time for this session. So we can start a
Yes,
little bit
so
later. I think that's fine.
also because is missing one of the speakers.
That's true. Yeah.
The other speaker, do we know if Sigrid received the PowerPoint from them or not? Or
Yeah, I don't know. I was like Sigrid, I was under the impression that she was just discussing for the previous session. But let's see. Hopefully she'll join.
we'll just send a quick email to the other speaker while we wait.
Guys, I fear that we lost the first presentation.
Oh no.
I'm happy to go ahead, and if they show up, they can go second.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully. Okay.
Thank you, Owen.
Oh, unless okay.
Maybe you want to wait for another few minutes,
Okay. Sure.
like
I defer.
yeah.
Yeah, why don't we wait until 6:40 and maybe once with this email to the other speaker, perhaps with the time difference, between Hawaii, and it can be confusing. So
Mhm.
I tried to join at 8:30 this morning in like 8:30 my time. I was like messaging Calvin like, how do I get in?
Are any of you in Hawaii? I'm guessing no. Yeah.
I'm in Manchester, in UK.
So when is the next Science for the People issue coming out? Has it already come out?
I'm not the publisher anymore, but
Oh, okay.
as far as I know, it should be coming out in 2 weeks. So you should be getting in the mail in 2 weeks, I think.
Great. Who is the publisher now?
Vasiki.
Basiki. Okay. I don't think I've met them yet.
So yeah, maybe we'll start in 2 minutes, and hopefully the other speaker arrives. I sent out an email, so if perhaps it's a time zone issue, then maybe they're ready to jump on. Okay, Owen, well, if you're ready to begin, then maybe that's the best option.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see that okay?
Looks good.
Okay. So yeah, thank you to the organizer of this panel, and to everyone who presented in the previous panel. I've spent the last few hours thinking about it. A lot of really fascinating material was presented. A lot of interesting historical stuff. So I've added a little bit of that to my talk at the very end, and it might be a bit abrupt, but I think it'll be of interest to the people assembled here. So I think it's justified. The title of this talk, which was my attempt to address the sort of future of the Marxism and STS, past, present, and future panel, is what if STS went on strike? And so in this talk, I'm going to be trying to make 2 points and then raising 2 questions and doing a bunch of other stuff besides, but that's the main plan. So first, I'm going to make a pretty straightforward empirical point, and that is that science, tech, engineering, and medicine, or STEM workers, among many, many others, have increasingly been going on strike, especially in North America and in the UK. Second point, in spite of the professed interest in practices of resistance and in relation to technoscience, recent STS scholarship does not seem to have engaged much with labor stoppage or strikes as a topic. So then I'm going to ask, what might it mean for STS to engage strike or labor stoppage as a form of intervention, not just topic, but actually a practice, or something that it would seek in the world that it's studying and trying to transform in a certain way. And finally, I'll ask, why did that, so the short version of that question is, what if STS scholars went on strike? Which I realize is a sort of a preposterous question, since STS is not a union. But so question 4, or point 4, second question is, how and why did that question become preposterous? And here I'm going to offer some long quotations, sort of primary source material from 2 scholars that were very important to my own STS sort of genealogy, Harry Collins and his student Trevor Pinch, who passed away a couple of years ago. Okay, so Wall Street Journal recently called 2023 the year of the strike. And if you look at this diagram, which I got from CNBC, you can see why they would say that. US labor strikes took off in 2023, with the numbers of workers on strike over the course of the year grew from 141,000 in 2021 to 224,000 in 2022. And they've already more than doubled from 2022 this year. And the year is obviously not over, so these numbers are going to go up. So an impressive increase in labor action in the US and to a large extent in other countries. I think it's quickly important to point out that if we look at the history of the 20th century, this is actually not a whole lot. It's kind of good to get a sense of scale and realize just how many workers were on strike over the course of the 20th century. But by 21st century or sort of neoliberal era standards, there have been quite a few people on strike. And it's interesting to see there's a little spike in 2018 and 2019 here. And then it fell down during COVID here. And now it's kind of popping back up again. So there's this interesting resurgence of strike action in the US. And much of this activity is being taken by STEM workers, right? So I put a bunch of headlines together. Some of these are more rhetorical in nature. For example, there's a New York Times article about this New Zealand researcher who published a journal article calling for a strike among climate scientists. No more climate research. These climate scientists are fed up and ready to go on strike. And then we have actual, like people on picket lines strikes, like the 75,000 workers at the Kaiser Permanente. These are medical or healthcare workers, the largest healthcare strike in recent US history. There is, I believe, at least a couple thousand postdocs and staff researchers going on strike at the University of Washington, engineering construction workers in the UK. In Ireland, there's been a series of strikes which are ongoing, kind of off and on, among medical scientists. University of Oregon, Columbia College adjunct faculty went on strike. In the UK, medical laboratory workers, even in Nigeria. According to Nature, huge strikes last year were disrupting research in Nigeria. My former union, the postdoc and lecturers union of the University of California, back when I was at UC Davis, they had a very successful strike. Halifax. So I think we can see there's really a quite surprisingly large amount of strike activity going on among the people that STS people study. It's becoming an increasingly important social practice among scientists and technologists, and beyond that, people who are affected by science and technology. So when we consider these labor actions alongside those of somewhat less STEMmy organizations like the UAW, which has an interesting relation to the academic workers, and the WGA, we begin to see what Kent Wong of UCLA Labor Center has called an unprecedented wave of labor strikes and labor protests arising from tremendous economic insecurity among the working class, right? And these strikes are also part of an increase in political protest among scientists, which has been documented by sociologists Scott Frickel and Fernando Tormes Aponte, who are affiliated with, it was brought up in the previous panel, the New Political Sociology of Science, I believe, or New Political and Economic Sociology of Science. So they're documenting this new wave of political activism among scientists, not just strikes, but protests, and actually probably more protests than strikes. So is this being reflected in recent STS research? So I did a sort of quick and dirty bibliometric study of the past 5 years of articles published in Social Studies of Science, the journal attached to this very conference, so perhaps a good index of what STS is talking about. Only a half dozen articles in the past 5 years referenced strike or going on strike, people struck, all these variants of strike in the context of labor over the past 5 years in SSS, and almost all of these are just mentioned in passing. So for example, you have to go back to 2020 in order to get the most recent examples, which were Bard Lawn's study of carbon budgeting and the modifying work of the IPCC, where he mentions the, quote, wave of school strikes and high-profile protests of recent years, calling for, quote, a climate emergency and to leave fossil fuels in the ground. Christopher Lawless has an interesting article about air traffic management systems, and he makes reference to how the international remaking and sort of denationalization of air traffic management systems can be, intentionally or otherwise, presumably intentionally, is also very useful for breaking strikes among national level air traffic controllers unions. So there's not complete silence about it, but these are both kind of in passing mentions of strikes as an aspect of a broader story, rather than sort of being foregrounded as a social practice to be studied. By contrast, there are far more references to drone strikes, a disturbingly large number of, well, I guess it's good that they're covering drone strikes, air strikes, military strikes, lots of rhetorical striking similarities, tones being struck, and so on. So I think the takeaway here is that there's a clear need for greater STS attention to labor withdrawal, labor stoppage as a social practice both among scientists and in response to new technologies and forms of knowledge. And here, of course, I'm thinking about things like automation, which presumably will at some point make it much harder to have a successful strike. Perhaps we're already there. So I'm going to step on my soapbox for the next couple of slides. So please excuse me for a moment, because I want to talk about my third point, which is thinking about labor stoppage as a possible STS intervention. And as I said, I regard this as sort of a preposterous provocation. And you see, this is the language from my abstract. And it was kind of deliberately, rhetorically, fiery, if only to kind of open up the rhetorical space in this in STS and these sorts of presentations. So let me just read from that, my abstract. So as earlier presenters have demonstrated, the emergence of science and technology studies as a scholarly interdiscipline has largely entailed a boiling off of class analysis, labor solidarity, and critiques of actually existing capitalist technoscience from what was, in many ways, a project of radical historical materialist critique. While this has proven to be a successful strategy for establishing STS within the neoliberal academy, it has also blurred and foreshortened the field's horizons of political possibility. Between the ongoing environmental and military industrial genocide of the global poor, the urgent need for wealth redistribution, and the decarbonization of the global energy system, and the longstanding indifference of the ruling elite, is worth asking whether STS scholars should continue to participate in the social reproduction of the higher education industry, the professional managerial labor pool, which makes it possible for this situation to continue, right? So what would happen if, instead of continuing to lure students into unpayable loans, generate fodder for intellectual property monopolists, and provide conscience laundering or plausible ethical deniability services for big tech or other agents of predatory rent extraction, STS went on strike? What if, for example, the tenured, that is, tenured and or relatively non-precarious members of 4S, EAS, ST, et cetera, refuse to continue letting their respective institutions profit from their prestige, rerouting their energy to organizing open teach-ins instead, and recruiting colleagues from other fields until some basic demands for environmental and economic justice were met? What if all the graduate students of STS and its cognate fields organized a collective debt strike? What would this take, and what might it accomplish? Would it mean the end of institutionalized STS as we know it, perhaps the end of tenure, which is already kind of on the way out, or would it be the beginning of something better? Is there nothing, if as people like I'll show Harry Collins say, there's nothing that we can or should do politically as STS scholars? If that's the case, what are some better or worse ways that we might do nothing? What are some different kinds of nothings that we might ponder doing? Okay, so how did this concept of a field is sort of loosely defined and sort of big tent as STS and sort of become preposterous, right? And in the sense of the first becoming last and the last becoming first, right? Like it's a non sequitur. Things are out of causal order here because you'd have to first organize STS into a body that could strike, right? But there was a time when that was something more possible, like in some sense, and I think that possibility was dissipated largely in what we saw in the last session during the 70s and early 80s, this split between Marxist radical science type people and STS type people. So here I have Harry Collins reminiscing in 2006 at an event that was supposed to be the 30th anniversary of STS, the idea being that STS started somewhere around 1976. And I think it really illustrates where he was coming from and how different things were in the mid-70s. Okay, so this is Harry Collins. The beauty of the new sociology of science, as I saw it, was that you could still talk about these huge questions that the normative Marxists were talking about and so forth by doing very small-scale case study empirical work. I just felt so refreshed as a sociologist by this possibility. At this time in sociology, as I say, it was basically normative Marxism. Almost everybody in Essex, circa 1970s, had to be a card-carrying Marxist. Otherwise, and then kind of trails off, but otherwise, nothing good. And the way that worked is that people justified this by their rebelliousness. These people were Marxist and they were rebels. They were against the dominant society. Of course, they were getting all the great jobs at the universities, and it wasn't very long before they were members of parliament. People working in the city, these rebels, but boy, do they know which side of their bread is buttered on. We've got to avoid becoming a social movement, defending the environment or whatever causes in fashion, and forgetting that our subject is the study of knowledge, not the defense of any particular substantive pieces of knowledge. And then I paraphrase, he further says that we shouldn't be a political movement that, quote, knows where its heart is, end quote. We should be instead an academic movement that has a lot of doubt about where its heart is. And I think that's a fairly accurate description of STS, how it's developed since then. Trevor Pinch was also at that event, so as a student of Harry Collins, and his response was kind of interesting. He said, "What was I doing in 1976? I was just beginning my sporadic adventures in unemployment. I guess I was becoming a sociologist of science in what was to become Thatcherite Britain." So there was still a sense that, like, okay, there's a sort of something that would come to be called neoliberalism coming into play here, a sort of commercialization of the academy, a sort of rise of the concept of the marketplace of ideas as the sort of hegemonic concept in science and how in politics of knowledge production. But then something happened. So in a later interview, Pinch provided a characteristically microsociological account for why, in spite of this awareness that you're unemployed in Thatcherite Britain, the SSK Bath Edinburgh School of Sociologists that he and Harry Collins were associated with did not get along with the more explicitly Marxist Science is Social Relations group, which at the time was sort of de facto led by Robert M. Young, Bob Young. So Pinch recounts a meeting, which I think is quite pivotal, of the British Sociological Association's Sociology of Science Study Group meeting at the London School of Economics right around 1978. He said, it looked like there could be a meeting of SSK people with the Science is Social Relations people. David Bloor presented his stuff. I didn't speak at the meeting. And then Bob Young held the floor. And my memory of it is, first time I met Bob Young, he was this really big, larger than life American guy and a huge ego. And he just dominated the whole thing. He didn't show any interest in what we were doing. He just wanted to convert us to his radical science as social relations view of the world. So there was no chance to have any sort of meeting or proper intellectual, how could these detailed empirical studies of science as social relations fit in with his radical program? You could see the two could come together, but he wasn't going to have it. And he didn't give any space for Bloor or anyone else. We all just left with that sinking feeling, oh, this isn't going to work, which is a pity. This is an interview I did with Trevor in 2018. And I think this, there's this sort of mythology around the 1931 meeting between Western and Soviet historians of science, the sort of birth of externalist history of science and Boris Hessen and so on. This is kind of like, a negative image of that, which happened a few decades later, where you had this recognized possibility of some sort of synthesis, but just sort of a failure to launch, which really came down to personal interactions, which is, fitting if you look at the sort of microsociological tradition that Harry Collins and Trevor Pinch worked in. So how did this interaction cash out? What did the sort of Bath School SSK opinion of Marxist thought on history of science and STS look like circa 1981? I had a scan of a 1981 lecture that Pinch gave at Bath University about Marxism, and I'll read some excerpts from it to kind of give you a sense of the boundary work really that was being done between Marxist historiography and Marxist social theory and this new, relativist sociology of science. So he said, Marxists have been keen to stress that the Marxist approach is the only truly scientific one. One hears of phrases such as scientific Marxism. In other words, Marxists have used the rhetoric of science in trying to legitimate their own activities. Clearly, if science itself became a problematic term, then Marxists could not claim that their approach is scientific, as opposed to the ideologically unsound approach of bourgeois sociology. And here he goes on to cite an example of Althusser, right? As an example of Marxists calling themselves scientific and using that sort of discursive resource. The second reason for lack of Marxist interest in science is the particular role given to scientific knowledge in the Marxist theory of man and his place in the natural world. And here he gives a brief sketch of Marxist theory of knowledge production. The Marxist position seems to depend crucially upon the possibility of man gaining knowledge of the objectively existing natural world. Such knowledge is usually thought of as scientific knowledge. It does allow the possibility that such knowledge might be distorted, that is ideological, by social interests. But in order to talk about the distortion of knowledge or ideology, the notion of a non-ideological knowledge must be present. Marxism thus generates a view of man gaining non-ideological knowledge of nature, such knowledge being called science. Because this notion of science rests at the heart of the Marxist position, Marxists may have been reluctant to investigate the possibility that science itself is an ideological construct. In way of contrast, for relativists, the natural world plays no part in their explanations. Thus, for relativists, it makes no sense to distinguish between science and ideology. So I present this very much not as, I'm not endorsing this, obviously. To me, I think this is not at all an adequate account of Marx's thought, or like Marxian thought about, in its best form, about the history and sociology of knowledge production. But I think it is symptomatic. Again, what understanding was current in this particular group in 1981. And it's really the same problems that many of the same problems that Edward brought up in his introduction in the previous panel. This question of realism, objective reality, and to a lesser extent, scientific science as a discursive resource or a claim that one makes in order to establish legitimacy. So I'm going to leave this quote, and I'm over time now, so I'll wrap up. Yeah, I just wanted to basically provoke a discussion with my questions, and then provide some interesting material to continue the discussions that we had in the previous session. So thank you very much.
We can open the question and answer session. Maybe I can profit of the role of an organizer. I have a curiosity, Owen. The interview that you made with Trevor Pinch has been published or not?
It has not, and if I'm trying to figure out the best way to make it available. If any of you would like it, I can share it. I also have an interview with there is a possibility that one of you asked me for it already and I forgot to send it. So if I don't send it, please ask again. But I'm happy to share it. There's also an interview that he did with David Bohm around the same period, 1978, that I've recently transcribed. David Bohm being a theoretical physicist with a strong background in socialism and Marxist thought. His theoretical physics was sort of a strange synthesis of well, anyway, that's beside the point. But it's an interesting document of how sociology of physics was being talked about alongside David Bohm at the time. So yeah, that's a long answer to your question, but happy to share.
Really interesting. I will be happy to read it. There are other questions?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Owen, for the talk. There's a lot in there that's really interesting. I think what I'm sort of curious about is like the institutional context of some of these people in the 1970s as they're sort of putting together this discipline, and obviously they need to get institutional backing for that. I wondered how much, I don't know if you would know this, but how much of the sort of turn away from Marxism was like, obviously there's these sort of personality clash moments, but like how much of it was more of a strategic question of like, okay, is the university in what is now becoming Thatcherite Britain going to be that interested in funding a new research institute if we're all Marxists here, or would it be more sort of palatable to have a more or a less politically engaged version of STS be institutionalized.
Yeah, see, I think from my perspective, it seems that these were small enough groups of people. I mean, at the Bath School of Science Studies was basically Trevor Pinch and Harry Collins, two people. And clearly, as that, I think that quote illustrates. And by the way, if you Google or if you like go on YouTube and search Harry Collins 30 years of STS, you'll find his talk there that's excerpted from. Harry Collins was clearly like, it seems like he had a little chip on his shoulder, perhaps understandably, in this strange era where, all the best jobs went to the Marxists. This sort of strange era from our perspective. I don't get the sense that there was any tactical thinking, like, oh, we're going to conceal our secret Marxism. I mean, I've talked about this in another context, but part of that Trevor Pinch interview is him talking about his very early days as an undergraduate, when he was, part of the Marxist International Group, which at the time was led by Piers Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn's now kind of fringe brother. So sometimes he has a certain degree of Marxist bona fides, but that perhaps tells you more about just how ubiquitous that was at the time among students in London. And that boiled off, as I say, and it's my preferred metaphor, pretty quickly once he started studying with Harry Collins. That quote about the sort of failed, like how Bob Young was like just not letting the synthesis happen, even though we thought there might be a possibility for it. I think that really is a kind of, it shows where people were coming from at the time. And it wasn't an overt hostility, but it was like, we're doing something different. We're doing something new and interesting, which at that time was exactly not Marxist.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, and of course, it wouldn't be a sort of deliberate strategy, but there's always, the institutional pressures and, what path is easier versus harder to take and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question of the material basis of accepted knowledge, right? And so it's interesting in that respect, as a sort of fine-grained account of that. I mean, STS survived in a way that Bob Young's program didn't survive, right? Bob Young, he kind of staked much of his legacy, such as was on, he championed Donna Haraway very early on, and Donna Haraway, of course, had a much stronger sort of relationship with Marxist thought in that era. But yeah, I mean, Bob Young and Trevor Pinch are both dead now, very recently. And I think, within STS, Bob Young is not a name that you hear quite as much as you hear Harry Collins and Trevor Pinch. So I think that's interesting.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. You mentioned when presenting that, great quote from Pinch, that it was sort of maybe a reductionist or like unfair characterization of Marxist approaches to science, and Marxist and Marxian philosophies of knowledge. I'm wondering, as someone who seems to be like very well versed in the ideas of Collins and Pinch, if you think there is a version of that critique that would sort of have validity, but that wouldn't sort of be a kind of reductionist, like is the critique sort of limited because their characterization of Marxism and is unfair, or do you think that there's like a version of this critique that maybe needs to be paid attention to, even if it was in much like made in good faith, I guess?
Yeah. I put up the slide just so that people can look at it. My impression is that one of the major failings of Marxist thought, even at the level of Karl Marx, Marx and Engels themselves, was a sort of credulity regarding a certain scientism, a certain scientistic bent, right? Taking science kind of at face value sometimes, if only rhetorically. When they get into the deeper questions and thinking dialectically, it becomes much more complex. But I think that is a sort of weak spot, and something that gets expressed in sort of vulgar Marxisms, that came around later, and really only relatively recent, more careful scholarship on Marx's writings has, I think, demonstrated this much more subtle, like process-oriented and view of science. It's not just like, this is, capital S science, and soon we'll have perfect knowledge about the world. I read Marx much more as saying that, the mode of production, entails a certain form of knowledge that's appropriate to it, right? A non-capitalist, so a capitalist science is true in the sense that it works within capitalism and is consistent with the capitalist worldview, and it makes the system continue to go even when it has sort of contradictions within it, right? A socialist science would be better, in that it would be linked to a more emancipatory political system, right? And more true to that system. So I see it as a complex normative question. So that's where I think they have a point, Collins and Pinch, where they're critiquing Marx. But I think they also focus too much on critiquing science, this recourse to the capital S science, as a sort of badge of your work, or a sort of a legitimating, word to use, or a way of distinguishing yourself from other forms of knowledge. I think that that critique has become much less useful in recent decades. In the era of like agnotology and so on, where So I think those are the two weak points that I see in both sides, and I think they fit together in an unfortunate way. And if that could be clarified, there really could have been a much more productive interaction between STS and Marxism. And I think Bob Young, frankly, was in his writings. I think his writings express, sort of awareness of that subtlety, and an ability to work through that. But I think it seems to be a question of people not getting along, strangely enough.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? I've got a new headset, so I don't know if this speaker's working. Yeah, great. Thanks, Owen. That was really interesting. Just a quick question. Well, a quick question from my end, probably requires quite a long answer that I'm sure you won't be able to answer in full, but you might have some initial thoughts on this. I like this provocation about the STS scholars as some kind of a political campaigning unit, but I wonder if you had any concrete steps in mind of how we would build that and how we would finally overcome the challenges that it seems that this meeting was unable to because of Bob Young's big personality, if that account is taken at face value. You know, how do we bridge that divide between existing STS scholarship and the more Marxist traditions on its fringes?
Yeah, that's a great question. A very difficult question. The question of praxis, beyond simply making a provocation to 8 people on a Zoom call. Is this? I guess I thought it's a useful place to begin thinking about strikes as something that should have more attention in STS, and then using that as an avenue to be like, okay, well, people express all sorts of righteous opinions in STS work and in their presentations and so on, but what would be the sort of most basic unit, like what in its most simplistic form might that look like effectively? Withdrawing labor is theoretically easier to do than performing labor, right? And so I thought that was an interesting and sort of under-considered possibility. It's not something that I expect to happen anytime soon. I've come to think of my engagement with Marxism and STS as kind of like keeping a flame going, rather than like building a machine to like powered by the steam from that flame. I think we're operating on a rather longer scale, but I do think I think it's useful to think in terms of job security and begin talking to our colleagues in that sense. Economic precarity, debt, I think, is a huge thing in the environment. Like I think raising these concrete issues, not just of like, are we doing, are we using the proper words, right? Or are we like, giving nuanced consideration to the particular topics? How are we approaching our fellow researchers, our colleagues, as workers? So I don't have any steps towards that besides this for now, but I think that's a way of talking that it would be, or that's a way of interacting with our colleagues that would be useful.
Well, so I have a question, and it's actually related to what Sam mentioned. I mean, obviously, this is a topic that I care a lot about, and I think a lot about that too. So my question might help everyone. Actually, it's not a question addressed to you, but everyone think about maybe the first step, right? So in unionizing union spaces, for example, there is a conventional wisdom is that when they go to lab and talk to STEM people to have them join a union, to have them like sign on to the strike vote, whatever, versus they talk to a person from the humanities. It's usually easier to talk to the person in the humanities than to the STEM people, because STEM people are usually they're apolitical, right? They still have that ideology. So where would you put STS people on that spectrum? Are they more humanities, or are they more like STEM? You also mentioned that they are becoming apolitical in a sense, right? So how would you? Is there that's my question basically.
I mean, I think it's year after year, it's getting harder to characterize the STS person in one simple way. In the early days, it was a lot of the pioneers of the field were scientists who were dissatisfied with the questions that they were able to ask, and at the technical level, Evelyn Fox Keller. Brian Wynn was a materials scientist, and then he went on to, I don't know that strand of, people from science flowing into STS. I don't really have a strong sense of the demographics of the average STS or the average 4S attendee, and whether they even call themselves an STS or, right. But it is an interesting, it's growing certainly. And so, yeah, I'm curious, because you have more expertise in this, in this sort of thing than I do, Calvin, how organizing works, what practices are, what, you know, and I see Science for the People as sort of an interesting seed crystal within the STS community that raises these questions and provides an opportunity to sort of organize people. But I think, yeah, perhaps, yeah, that's my long-winded answer.
Josh, I think you're next in the queue.
Sure. Yeah. I was going to offer a bit of an anecdote to that question about about STS and unions and so on. So I was at York in the STS department while we were on strike in 2018, which at the time, actually, I think it still is the longest university strike in Canadian history. And the turnout among STS students was pretty high on the picket lines. Like we had the way the picket lines were set up, it was like, you know, by department more or less, and sort of like allocating departments by like number of people that showed up, and our picket line was mostly STS people. But what actually contributed to me leaving academia partly was because noticing how few of the professors in the department actually expressed any support. I think we had one professor who showed up at the picket line. And we were, the union at the time, we were pushing a campaign to get a lot of the faculty associations to pass a motion of non-confidence in the president of the university because the strike was dragging on for so long. And a number of the STS professors were resistant to this, and like one who was serving as a dean at the time was making some argument about how it was too complicated to, like, you have to consider both sides and all the nuance and all this stuff. So yeah, I think there might be a bit of a generational divide within STS between, and it also probably has to do with you know, economic circumstances and so on. But like, yeah, some maybe at the undergrad and grad student level, there might be more willingness or openness towards labor activism, and then it seems like at the professor level, it sort of drops off pretty dramatically.
Yeah, which is the exact opposite of, you know, from a certain logical standpoint. I mean, you know, who should be the if we imagine that everyone, if there's a relatively consistent political orientation, you know, which is a fiction, but yeah, you would think the people with greater job security would understand their responsibility to employ that, you know. But yeah, that's a really interesting anecdote, Josh. Thank you.
Owen, you made some really great observations about this sort of what seems to be a lack of engagement in social studies of science on the issue of striking STEM workers, which I think, you know, opens up a interesting question about like why that might be. But I think that the question of, you know, why STS should pay attention to that is fairly straightforward. Like it does seem just like a fairly obvious topic that would be within the realm of what STS should be focusing on. I guess I'm interested in flipping the question a little bit, and I don't mean this in a provocative way or flippant way, like, but I guess the question is, for radical science movements, for the striking STEM workers, for the people who are involved in that, you know, what is it that STS could offer them? Like, are we just sort of perceiving this as an interesting sort of sociological question for sociologists of science, you know, sociologists of science to look at, because it's an emerging phenomenon within, you know, the organization of scientific knowledge production. But if it's this idea of like the interpenetration of ideas between, you know, STS and Marxism, or radical science movements and STS, like I'm interested in what you think, or what anyone else thinks, like the sort of productive contributions that S might be able to make to people who are involved in organizing, who are involved in striking, who are involved in that kind of more direct sort of political engagement. Like, what are some of the ways that the reasons why, you know, STS could be generative, could be productive or not, you know, for people who are, you know, involved in that?
That's a great question. I want to. I'm really interested to hear what other people have to say, and for this to become a broader discussion. But I guess I'll tackle that one first. But if anyone wants to jump in, and I'd love to, if possible, expand the discussion that we began with Sigurd's comments at the previous session. Yeah, what does STS have to offer the radical science movement? I think there's a lot of good work. I mean, it's a lot of good empirical work, you know. I mean, so, and it's work of a different kind, you know. Especially a lot of early STS work, I think, is where you can find this sort of, from like a radical science perspective, the most palatable accounts of the field, is the sort of most, you know, politically not polarized, but you know, militant perspectives, right? And I think that, so I'm interviewing Sal Restivo, who I'm not sure if you all have heard of Sal, but tomorrow I'm going to his house to talk to him about this exact thing. So I'll take your question to him, because he is very much of the, you know, he's very much at the heart of early STS work, and he did a lot of really interesting work on the sociology of mathematics, and bringing in sort of a conflict sociology perspective with people like Randall Collins. And that's sort of strain of STS work that I feel like it really speaks to an SFTP, like a radical science perspective, in a way that a lot of the more recent work might not. Though that said, I think a lot of the more recent work is also very good on you know, identity-oriented issues. But that said, I think like the field has I don't know. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to like pontificate about the nature of the field any further. But I'd point you to work like the work of like people in that vein, the sort of, you know, left out STS work, which is still continuing. You know, people like Sigrid and you know, many of us, providing a site for imagining how science might be different, and getting past the and not getting hung up on the question of whether science is political or not, but rather taking that as the starting point. I think there's a place for that to be cultivated further. Oh yeah, Selra Stevo.
Great, thanks, Owen. And maybe, you know, I know, Sigrid, you have things that you're working on right now, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that question. And then maybe, if not, you know, we could reopen some of the points that you brought up earlier today, because I know Josh had mentioned wanting to speak to some of those issues as well. But I guess, do you have any thoughts on
I really
anything?
don't. I feel like you guys are much more knowledgeable on that than I am. I did, but this is so selfish because I screwed up the time. I actually worked it all out so I could be here, and except that I thought it was 7 because I got the time wrong. Anyway, I don't even know what to say. I made so many mistakes today, like can't even start. But I did. Is there a way without like boring everybody else and like repeating too much to understand what work stoppage as STS method is? Because I'm so curious, and it's not like spelled out in the slide, but if that's too redundant, then I can just follow up with you later, Owen.
I mean, it's just as simple as it sounds. Kind of like it's kind of like the idea that, you know, if we could harness, you know, to what extent STS work has become you know, necessary for social reproduction, or like for, you know, for universities to continue doing their work, like, you know, beginning to think in terms of refusal of our work as scholars, or of like encouraging that discourse, or encouraging that you know, as a practice among the people that we work with, you know, like the scientists and engineers that we study, or the communities that are resisting it, that you know, it's just spreading that idea, you know. It's sort of a Hail Mary concept.
So it's like it would be a method of activism as opposed to a method of analysis. Like,
yeah, it would be a method. Yeah, it would be more of an intervention, I suppose, rather than
okay,
method.
cool.
Yeah, I was thinking about it as method, and I think that there's something there in thinking about it as method, like, and I think there's something there in like in bourgeois sociology, like, you know, ethnomethodology had Harold Garfinkel, you know, they had this concept of the breaching experiment, you know, these ways of sort of going around and disrupting everyday experience by refusing to play along with our social scripts at a microsociological level. I think like refusal to play along with broader bureaucratic scripts might be an interesting way of sort of STS exploring its place within, you know, the higher education industry community, and all of its different aspects, and a way of engaging people in other fields also, like, you know, yeah, like I was thinking about Isabel Stenger's call for slow science, right? The Manifesto for Slow Science, which is basically like a sort of spin-off of the slow food movement, or like, you know, these other like slow, you know, largely consumer oriented, you know, like, but where the idea is to improve your products and improve your consumption, improve the science that we make by taking it slowly and not being driven frantically by publish or perish, things like that. I think that there's an interesting way of extending that concept to stoppage, to like, you know, what would science look like or what would STS look like if it, you know, periodically evaluated its, you know, whether and how it wants to participate in, you know, the systems that sustain it, you know, and that's perhaps a little grandiose, you know, view of like what STS is and how powerful it is, but I still think it's a place to start.
Thanks, I appreciate that, because I was dying of curiosity. It's fascinating. I love it. There's slow pedagogy too, right? Like we have, I don't know if you all have it at your universities too, but there are people who are like, you know, gathering people and talking about how to slow down the classroom and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Slow readings. Yeah, that's definitely, yeah.
A quick follow-up on this. The problem of the slow science is how to construct a social organization of science in this neoliberal situation without competition. Is that the problem? Right? And from the point of view of praxis, how we can imagine as the contemporary academy without competition? Is we have to make kind of an effort to construct all of this.
Absolutely. And I think that's a useful critique of the slow science concept. Like, okay, this is good, but it's putting the cart before the horse in a sense, because you have to create a material situation where knowledge production, less competitive knowledge production is or non-profit driven knowledge production is possible, right? And that requires solidarity within the people doing the work.
Because at the moment the system is that more your CV is strong, more found you can put together, and more research you can develop again. And this is a kind of circle, right? It's clearly a capitalistic mode of production in science, but it's very difficult to imagine how all of this system of production could be changed. And this will be so to say an issue for science for the people.
Certainly. And maybe this is a way of thinking about the possible, generative interactions between STS and radical science people. Like Josh's talk about, the sort of the sort of remaining scent of Marxism in laboratory life, right? Which I thought was fascinating. Like, like the cycles of accreditation is sort of a refashioning of the cycle of capital. When you think about Latour's legacy, he went beyond STS and became something like a public intellectual, and I think shaped the way a lot of quite influential people think about how knowledge production works and should be structured, and how to make it work most effectively. And here I'm thinking of Philip Mirowski's whole thing about Bruno Latour is a neoliberal. Like, the Latourian program is sort of like putting a mirror up to the development of a neoliberal science, and saying, this is what you're doing. And like sort of removing the macro view of like historicizing the capitalist mode of production, right? That basic thing of like, we have never been modern, right? So STS has an interesting legitimating role with respect to, at a certain level, how, legitimate knowledge is produced, at universities and think tanks and things like that, I think. And Latour is an interesting example of that process going in the wrong direction, perhaps, or in a direction which I think he realized was wrong, and tried to he tried to steer in different directions, but he never steered back into that, Marxist path that he was obviously steeped in as a member of the French Academy, like in the 60s and 70s.
Please, Sigrid, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is not my strong suit at all, and I've just been really increasingly curious about what you all would think about this, because some of the people you talk to, like I'm thinking like Kelly Moore, just despises Latour and finds like Latour is like took us in completely the wrong direction, and we can't build any kind of activist agenda on this stuff. It's just hopeless. And then it's like you turn around and there are all kinds of people who are like, I'm just thinking of this one person who I was hoping would do a book for the book series. And I don't know if it's going to come together because she's got a lot of other things going on and she's not really in a book field, so she doesn't need to do it. But she has like this dynamite program. And she works in the field of education and doing like very radical like education especially with African American students, getting them coding. And she has like a lot of very sophisticated theory going on, but also like her main thing is praxis. She's like doing the education with the kids, right? And it's very social justice, I mean, it's not just social justice, it is a social justice praxis. And she, like, it's like all Latour and Pinch and people, like, it's all this stuff that I think, it inspires people, like it inspires activist type people in ways that we might not predict. And so I'm just like really curious as to, what you all think about that. Like, what happens when something that we look at and say, this guy is just, abandoned analysis that accounts for class and structure, et cetera. And yet people are actually actively using it in their, in their activist praxis. I'm just really curious as to what you all think about that.
No, it's a big problem. And for example, another similar situation related to this is, for example, the Agamben perspective that is quite used in the militant and radical movements. And but the Agamben theory is very problematic from the political point of view, from the point of view of praxis, but there is kind of contradiction. Social movements could be impressed by some, so to say, bad teachers.
Sigrid, I wanted to hear more about after the last panel, the case of China, which is going through, it sounds like it's went through a sort of similar process in the movement from the dialectics of nature as the dominant science and society, like, field to, philosophy of science and technology. And we got a taste of that with the previous panel. And I had a friend of mine, he had a copy of like the latest issue of, what used to be the dialectics of nature. I don't know if the journal is still called that, but you look at it, it's all like very philosophical stuff. It's all like Zeno's paradox and so on. And, so I got the sense that switch happened around the time of Deng Xiaoping. But then there's sort of still presumably some sort of legacy there. And like, just the case of like, ascendant or like increasingly powerful places like China, in contrast to sort of declining empires like UK and US, where presumably this these changes in political and economic power will be reflected in changes in how knowledge is produced and what sorts of ideas people will want to work with. But I think it's something that's like just a big question mark for so many Anglo sphere STSers.
Yeah, and I mean I wish Inyi, right, was still here to talk about this too, because it's such I'm definitely, like, a lot of what they were talking about was just on the margins of the kinds of stuff I look at, and I just haven't looked enough at the actual development of these fields. There is a good overview of it in the Arnova and Torchetti volume, as a kind of starting point. My sense, I mean, I definitely just had some real, I'm not, super excited about, Yu Guangyuan and these folks as like kind of models of how we can do. It's not, I don't see it as critical, frankly, because if it's like, if it's part of the state, and if it's, part of like really official establishment thought, and it's building I just don't see how we could possibly use that for critical work. But, I mean, I think that's going to come down a lot of times to how people feel about the state. And my sense, continues to be that this is like a split that we paper over a lot in our movements, right? Is, how we feel about the state, and I think it splits the left China folks quite a bit as well, but and I'd actually be really curious to hear what you all think about it. Like, is that attention in Science for the People, or is it not even attention in Science for the People in terms of how either critical or potentially excited we are about a strong socialist state that embraces, Marxism, right? But at the same time is going to honestly enforce like a specific, teach a very specific and like train people in really specific ways of thinking about Marxism. So I just can't go there with Yu Guangyan. And Yu Guangyan, it's interesting because he, from my perspective, he's like a classic technocrat because it's all wrapped up in this like it's very systems thinking, very systems engineering. It's the kind of the same big paradigm that gave us the one-child policy, which was developed by ballistic missile scientists and not by demographers. Like the Marxist demographers were totally sidelined in that debate. And it was the people who could crunch numbers and look as objectivist as possible who were embraced in terms of developing that policy. And the Guanyin stuff, for me, it all looks very much like that. And it's, Chen Shih-sun, the, father of the silkworm missile, who became extremely influential in Deng's administration as well. They're fascinated by these big systems thinking kinds of paradigms. And so, exactly how the panelists were, presenting it earlier today, it all, like these ideas, like it all fits together. You've got the nature, you've got the society, you can, work it all out together. And it's like a package that promises, it promises you could look at it as holistic, or you could look at it as a totalitarian, but it's like, basically it's like we're going to engineer the world, and it looks Promethean to me. It does not look to me like something that's going to give us the tools to develop a critical understanding of state power, and especially when state power is wrapped up with, kind of a arguably neoliberal economics, although I know that those are fighting words too. But I don't know that any of that helped. Again, like this is stuff I'm really myself trying to figure out, and I definitely do not have all the pieces of this puzzle by a long shot. So I'm really curious what you all think, and what you all thought of the presentation. I mean, I hope it's okay to talk about their presentation when they're not here, but I'm curious as to what people thought of that.
I just put Yu Guangyang's name and just some context in the chat because today was the first time that I'd ever heard of him, even though he's clearly an extremely important figure.
I had never thought of him as an important figure in STS. Like that had never crossed my mind to see him as that. And that may just be my ignorance, right? But yeah. I think of him, he's an architect of the Deng era market reforms, like one of the major market reforms architects. He was a speechwriter for Deng Xiaoping. And he contributed a lot, and also in really interesting ways. I don't mean to say that it's not interesting stuff. Like during the 1980s, you see all of these really fascinating hybrid fields, like between ecology and economics, and economics and society. And like, they're doing all of this really interesting work that you could see as, getting outside of silos and bridging all of this. But I also, it makes me worried because I see it as a very, very technocratic vision. It's very closely associated with the technocratic Deng era stuff. But yeah, so if you guys all know him as an STS person, that's like totally news to me. But it very well may be my ignorance.
No, it's probably characterized him as a Chinese STS figure. That is kind of the impression that we were getting from the talk. But yeah, maybe Chinese STS is itself sort of like, a complex translational problem. But it does seem like like, so under his influence, such as it is, there is a sort of, increasing emphasis on intellectual labor over manual labor, right? Like, and like, so the whole idea of social nature, like, there's nature, and then there's social nature. I'm like, this is all just like, it's hard to get one's bearings, and thinking about how to relate to it. Yeah, like on the issue of the state, as you say, Sigrid.
One person who might be
Gosh,
on your radar, who here was were any of you at the Ann Arbor meeting? Calvin, why can't I remember the Ann Arbor? No, nobody. So at the Ann Arbor Science for the People meeting in 2018, is that right? God, I'm like missing my years.
Yeah,
Okay.
18. Yeah.
My I guess I can call her my friend, my colleague, Huang Yu. Her family name is Huang, and she did her PhD in anthropology at University of Washington, and then she was in Hong Kong for a while, and now she's at Minzu University. Why can't I think of anyway, it's like the National Minorities University of China in Beijing. Fantastic anthropologist, and she and some colleagues are doing this great work, for example, on AI and labor. So she's like really steeped in labor. She's, a proper Marxist anthropologist of science, and doing this really interesting. She also started her dissertation work was creating a collective shrimp farm in the Pearl River Delta and looking at production of knowledge and labor. But she's gone on and they're showing how so much of the AI is actually reliant on human labor. Like you've got these humans who are basically serving the machines, like identifying cars, what's a car and what's not in the, anyway, this is all stuff you probably know, but she's amazing. And, she's the person I might reach out to also to get a kind of read on what she thinks STS looks like in China today. I might just, follow up with her on that, or maybe we could even get her to write something for Science for the People or something. I think she's incredible.
we raised hand from Josh.
Yeah, I was just thinking of your comment, Sigrid, about the sort of systems orientation, and some of the criticisms that in like I'm thinking of Lukács in particular, his criticism of Engels, and there's been this sort of recurring criticism of this dialectics of nature approach that it sort of ends up with something like a systems theory that tries to sort of engineer human and natural systems and study them just as like problems to be solved essentially. But I wonder if there's also in the original dialectics of nature text or anti-Dühring and some of these texts, if there's like something that can be extracted for like a critical approach to science that is not just a sort of technocratic engineering discipline. Yeah, so I mean, I find those works pretty fascinating. Obviously, there's a lot that's dated and not entirely relevant anymore, but I think what Engels is trying to do, at least, is to look at the actual content of scientific knowledge and not just some of the external circumstances around scientific knowledge production, but like looking at the content of the knowledge and trying to be critical in studying that knowledge. And I wonder if that's something we can sort of build on today as well.
Do you guys know this article by Dick Levins on systems theory and systems thinking and dialectical materialism? I'm blanking on the actual title, but it's the kind of gift that keeps on giving. I go back to it over and over again. It's a super brilliant. I think I find Levin so he's so clear. Like it's just like you read it, it's like, oh my God, it's so clear. Yeah, systems, I think it's systems thinking. Anyway, I'll find that too and stick it in the chat.
Dialectics and systems thinking. Yeah, I found it. Oh.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty great. You know, I mean he's basically talking about how the you know, the systems theory, you just eviscerates, you know, what's really critical, you know, in dialectics, and you know, it takes out power, and it takes out action, and it takes out all kinds of things. Yeah, I think that's actually where he started developing, if I'm remembering right, this example that he actually then developed further at the Science for the People conference at UMass in 2014, where he talks about like a diabetic factory worker, you know, and like, how do you analyze, you know, if you want to analyze the endocrine system or whatever, like if you don't put the factory worker in the factory and understand like what's happening to their system because of the working conditions that they're in, like what if they were allowed to take breaks and take a snack, you know, like what if they have a union representative who's like, you know, it's a really great metaphor, I think, for just understanding like, you know, what Marxism gives you that you don't get if you're just, you know, thinking about systems in a less politicized way.
Before I forget, Sigrid, you mentioned the one-child policy being the product of a ballistic missile scientists. Can you recommend a reading on that? Because that sounds like something that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, this book is incredible. And there's an art, you know, as with so many books, right? There's like an article that does it almost just as well, kind of thing, which I can't remember what it's called, but I could send you that as well if you wanted the shorter version. But yeah, it's an amazing story, and it's like just one of the most, you know, kind of clearest examples of what you get when you put things in the hands of people who think everything can be solved by crunching numbers and don't like pay attention to the, you know, society and culture and things like that.
I don't want to keep hogging time, but one other thing that I was curious about that came up in the last session, Sigrid, was your point about how so often, even like from the Chinese perspective, the story, the narrative is about the West doing something and then China catching up, right? And that's, you know, the kind of in contrast to the, well, or in tension, at least with the Joseph Needham kind of history of science in China, which I think is the extent of, you know, sort of people who don't focus specifically on the history of science in China and Chinese STS, like that's what they know. So, but like, I'm curious about how, to what extent that narrative is, or what alternatives are available to it in the Chinese literature, I suppose, or because and this is kind of specific, but like I'm teaching a course on this like introductory STS course called What is Science? And I'm trying to like make the syllabus more like talking about the origins of science, not just as some weird thing that came out of Europe and then spread with capitalism. You know, wanting to give a sort of broader sense of, you know, the sources of science and things like that. and the complexities of of how it was formed. So that, I don't know, that's just a question that I had. More readings you could recommend or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great stuff out there now. I mean, on the question of you're wanting like kind of pre influx of Western science and technology, like like there's interesting stuff about the late Qing period and like reconsidering modern science in China and not like seeing it as through this prism of failure. And there's several things I could recommend on that. But then, in some ways it's, even more interesting to see, I'm just thinking of like, there's a historian of Madison, Angelo Leung in Hong Kong, at University of Hong Kong, who has this great book on leprosy, and it actually like it gives you, what people in China, like how leprosy was understood, like minus Western biomedicine and public health. And then like what's the colonial context and how people handled that, and like how like the state starts to think about public health and in response. So there's stuff like that. There's also there's a great book on madness by Emily Baum that similarly just gives you just like this kind of a sense, and this is all it's 20th century, the Emily Baum thing, but it also kind of gives you the sense of like there's so much going on and there's so many different ways of thinking about madness, right? And then you have like the colonial context, right, and the power relations that and then you get and the state. So I don't know, I guess for me, I'm like such a modernist, right? But like the relationship like anything that can get the state power and the colonial like the kind of the geopolitical context in which Western science becomes valorized because of the power differences, to my mind is interesting. But then there's great stuff from much earlier too. Like you could go back to like Tong Song Dynasty, and just not even, and like, get people to think about what natural knowledge, right, looks like in a different context. Yeah,
Great.
I don't know if any of that
I'll
was
send you an
helpful.
email about that. Thanks.
Yeah, send me an
I mean,
email and like tell me what you want, and I'd love to share favorites. But I feel like I'm really dominating this conversation, and I didn't mean to do that.
No, me too. But I want to bring up something that Chris Cohen in the previous session brought up, which is this idea of like the problem of like forming international solidarity via the academic community and through like STS, which I think is really a crucial point. It was illustrated pretty starkly by so Nordhaus and then this whole group of people interested in Marxist STS. They were putting together a pretty exciting international project with like we're going to have a conference here, we're going to have a conference in Russia, then a conference in the US, and a conference in China, and so on. It's this really thrilling meeting. And then the Russia-Ukraine conflict began like shortly thereafter, and that completely went out the window. Like and they're trying to like do something, but like it became clear just how vulnerable international academic solidarity can be to these geopolitical crises that seem to be mounting one on top of the other. So thoughts about like how how to build international solidarity, this Republic of Letters that he kind of referred to, would be interesting.
Well, I have a different question, if it's okay to steer the conversation a little bit away from. I want to circle back to Josh's talk earlier. So you mentioned, I mean, obviously, like you were analyzing Latour's work. So I mean, it's using a very micro scale analysis of scientific reproduction, and my impression, I read the book, and my first impression was that it does not apply anymore because it's written in 79, and the production of science today is completely different, and I mean, he's very meticulous in documenting everything and talking about like personal conflict and all those kind of things that are they don't apply anymore today, right? I know because I'm I am in the production process, so I can say this. So my question for you is that what would you approach this kind of study to study the scientific process to not fall into the trap that Latour did, without like a macro scale to guide you, and then you get lost in your very specific like temporal trap.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing. So we read this book shortly after Latour died, with in the Marx and STS group that Owen was organizing. And so when I read it, I guess about a year ago, one thing that struck me in terms of this sort of anachronism was the way that citation counts are presented as like this sort of new method of like, like here's this new social science thing that we can use to uncover like the sort of trends in science, whereas of course today, like tracking your citations and all this is like sort of an everyday part of knowledge production, and to some extent I think the book in certain ways kind of prefigures the developments that happen later. So like in using things like citation counts to analyze science, they're sort of building a world in which citation counts are going to be part of the way that science is evaluated. So I think in a sort of negative sense, if your book is successful enough at presenting a picture of what science is like, then you might end up not being dated just by the fact that the world comes to resemble the book, light imitating art kind of thing. So that's one thought that comes to mind. But I do think partly because, well, I think there's still some value in having like a very close picture of the way that a particular field of biochemistry worked in 1979. Having this sort of very detailed analysis of that is valuable, but I think without sort of tying that in with a bigger picture, like I talked about in my presentation, you risk that kind of anachronism where something that you sort of argue is like the way that science works in general ends up just being like the way one lab worked in 1979. So yeah, having some way of moving between that local scale and then a much broader scale of like analyzing where that lab fits in the development of science and technology, over the course of the 20th century, for example. I think that sort of having that larger scale in mind or like in the background to some extent would help to avoid that kind of dating yourself, making your studies not really relevant, a couple of decades later.
Yeah, I do get the sense that the case studies of STS are a lot of the classic case studies are getting kind of dusty. You know what I mean? So your point, Calvin, is really interesting. It makes me think about the how to organize the lab book that you guys put out, which is more sort of about politics and so on. But you get a sense of like the what it's like to be a scientist nowadays better than you get reading Latour and Woolgar.
speaking of the organize the lab book, Calvin, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about the questions that Owen was sort of raising about what if STS went on strike in light of some of the work that you've been involved with, both in organizing scientists and sort of chronicling the efforts that they've been engaged with, but sort of from outside of STS. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on the points that Owen was raising, and to speak a little bit on that Organize the Lab project.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for putting me on the spot. So I mean, obviously, in terms of organizing STEM, I can say a lot about that. I don't know the STS as a field that well, but I'll use the example in STEM, and you can see if that fits with STS as a field. So in terms of like trying to organize like STEM people, I mean, obviously, there's the old way, the SATP way, the old way. Like you think about the product of your labor is being how that's being used, and appeal to their conscience, appeal to their social, like their ethics, basically. Like genocide's happening right now. You're making this technology that could be used this in that way, and that's one way to like raise their consciousness, right? And obviously the classical labor, the labor, legislation way is basically appeal to their precarity, and that's something that because all the STEM, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's STEM or humanities, like the grad students are underpaid, and so is postdocs. So that's an easy way in. So and the strategy is to combine the two. Like you combine the ethical, the more socially conscious like way of trying to approach them with their own labor precarity. So for me, that is the way. I mean, there's still ways to like, I mean, different context, different people. Like the combination of the two may be incongruous, but I think like that is the long-term solution for getting those people on board to to have a strong militant movement in STEM. So I don't know whether that applies to STS, because the product of STS is not as straightforward as, like, let's say a physicist making some kind of technology, right? So I mean, so I want to hear about that too.
Yeah, the precarity is a good common denominator, though, and I guess that is kind of what I was trying to get at with like appealing to that precarity, and thinking as STS scholars at that level, and letting that that permeate how we're thinking about our research as well. Even though that's kind of a tough leap to make. It's not something that we're habituated to, but it's also something that's sort of unavoidable, the way that our material conditions shape the kinds of knowledge that we make. And yeah, like the sort of the idea, like, yeah, STS people don't, you generally don't have to worry about your work being weaponized, though that does happen sometimes in anthropology, or used to the war on terror and like that whole scandal, or STS work being used to market some new pesticide, or I don't know, things like that. But it's fascinating to hear the sort of nitty-gritty of your organizing work, Calvin.
Yeah, like in a way that I mean, the precarity is a lot more a lot more salient for humanities majors, in grad school, because they're getting paid even less than STEM, right? And that's statistically proven. So for them, it's easier to organize because they're the worst of they're the most precarious in the cohort, right? In terms of and also like the job prospect is also not as good as STEM, right? So that's humanities in general. And I mean, I wonder what STS is like. Is that similar to other fields in humanities in general? Because if that's the case, then it's just like we can just see that as any other,
Can I add on to that
I guess
question?
the question is, yeah, go ahead. I mean, the question is like, what's like what like is there a need to distinguish STS from others like sociology or other type of humanities majors?
Not for the purposes that you're talking about, I don't think. I don't think it's unique in that way. It's, you know, it's certainly no less precarious than other humanities or social science fields.
Just related to that, I mean, it strikes me, you know, like the coolest STS scholars in my mind are like the ones who are like out there doing solidarity work and using like, I'm just like endlessly inspired by the folks who are involved with the East's Journal in Taiwan, and they've like done, you know, all of this solidarity work with communities that you know, like this big lawsuit against RCA, which polluted the you know, the water in the community, but also like exposed all of these workers in their Taiwan-based factories, you know, to all these chemicals, and they had all of these, you know, cancers. And the STS scholars like went in there into the courtroom and used their like production of knowledge understanding, you know, to undermine RCA's, you know, claims, and to, you know, demonstrate the ways in which, you know, they were skewing the facts, and, you know, to, you know, kind of support the grassroots epidemiology and all that kind of stuff. But it strikes me, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but like, do the tobacco companies and the corporations, do they hire STS? But like, do they recognize us as a, you know, a possible resource in the courtroom or in their strategies? I mean, it's not actually totally beyond plausibility that they would do that, right? Because in a lot of ways, their strategies are all about, you know, trying to convince people of a particular philosophy of science, in which, you know, confusing people about, you know, causation and that kind of stuff. I don't know the answer of it. I'm not sure I ever even thought about it, but are they tapping us?
Yeah, actually, I sort of wanted to jump off of that point because the article that you sent, Sigrid, the Oreskes and I forget the other author. But anyway, that article talks about a couple of examples of. It doesn't sound like, at least from their presentation, doesn't sound like these people were directly sort of on the payroll of like tobacco companies or anything like that. But about all these STS scholars that sort of see their role in sort of challenging science as like and, you know, studying controversies and things like that as like this sort of neutrality in controversies, where the controversy is only a controversy because oil companies are funding anti-climate science or something like that. It reminds me also of I forget his name now, but there's this one guy that I came across like while going through the archives of social studies of science, that like he's done papers on the water fluoridation controversy, and he also did a paper on the theory that AIDS is a result of the oral polio vaccine, and the papers are like very as far as I can tell, like sympathetic to these theories that, you know, this what's essentially a conspiracy theory at this point about the origin of AIDS, and so yeah, so the fact that STS journals are sort of places where you can publish something like this is you know, sort of worrying, but and I think Latour at some point sort of acknowledged this in some of his writings about climate science, where he wanted to be able to say that, you know, climate change is a real thing and it's not just something that we made up or whatever. But at the same time, his whole approach to science made that sort of impossible for him to say. So he had to come up with like sort of complicated ways of not really saying it. And yeah, so I think this also ties in with some of the questions about objectivity versus relativism that I talked about in my presentation that were sort of debated between the Marxist scholars of science and then Latour's approach and like STS more broadly. So yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer, but like because I don't think that we can just sort of like turn back the clock and just say, oh, we're just gonna like stick with objectivity with a big, capital O and everything. But yeah, I think having some sort of grasp of objectivity in some sense of that term that allows us to say that oil companies funding anti-climate science is not like a productive form of knowledge production or something like that.
I just want to make one. I also have to run because I have to go to a sleep study tonight that just got booked last minute. But I was just thinking on the question that Owen took up from the presentation earlier about the sort of transnational solidarity work, and Gerardo's comment about efforts to sort of work outside of some of the pressures of competition and some of the some of the pressures that get exerted on the production of knowledge. And I'm wondering if there are examples of STS work that looks at sort of international like scientific community organizations that are explicitly trying to do this. I'm part of a group called the Global Lakes Ecological Observatory Network, which is an example of something that's very self-consciously trying to do that. There was one STSer who had been studying that group for a few years, but she was coming at it from infrastructure studies and looking at sort of like the sensor buoy networks that they were creating. Like, I think maybe the focus wasn't so much on the efforts to kind of like build this international collaborative non-hierarchical sort of like open science, but in a different kind of way from just the sort of open data like meaning of open science. So I'm just wondering if there are examples of STS studies that anyone can think of that kind of look at other projects like the Glion project, where it's examples of scientists who are sort of like with maybe not operating based on some grand theory of like what they are like existing in contrast to, but are kind of self-consciously trying to like produce science in a different way. Like different in the sense that like that transnational like component is really at the forefront of what they're trying to do.
That's a good question. There may well be. I have to go also. I guess we're over time. But we should continue this conversation in the email thread that I think. Let's see.
I also got super distracted because my kids are in the background, so I'm not 100% sure I grasped the question you were asking, Edward, but there's this great article that I use a lot in my classes by Giovanna Di Ciro on border, like it's on the US-Mexico border and labor stuff and environmental organizing and epistemology. It kind of got everything in there, but I couldn't quite tell if that was actually the direction you were going in or not. And I apologize if I missed it because I was hearing stuff behind me.
That's okay. We can resume this.
Talk about it. And I love thank you for those things that you put in the chat, Edward. I'm super fascinated by public relations, citizen science. Definitely follow up on that. Mm-hmm. Thank you guys again for organizing this. And like, I wish I had been less flaky today, but man, there's a lot going on. So it was really an honor and a pleasure and a delight to get to hang out with you for hours today. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah,
thanks everyone. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
All right, chat later.
Have a good sleep study.